Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Okay, so in 2016, NATO declared cyberspace a domain of operations, a domain of war. And they acknowledged that for the first time that the battles of the future, or even now, would take place on land, sea, and air, and in cyberspace. And this sort of seismic announcement passed almost unnoticed. I noticed it, because it really entails a paradigm shift to actually conceptualize cyberspace as a place, as an environment. And when we do that, to recognize the impact of environment on human behavior, the psychology of the environmental experience. So the NATO position now raises questions in terms of territorial jurisdiction of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, over, for example, international crimes against humanity and acts of aggression committed via the internet. So there were 120 countries worldwide in the ICC, except the United States. And under the Rome Statute, effectively, the ICC has called for everybody to act together to fight impunity in cyberspace. In other words, people getting away with things in cyberspace. So I think going forward, in terms of thinking about cyberspace as a place, we have to ask ourselves, well, what does an atrocity or systematic crime against humanity look like in cyberspace? And is there a role for the ICC in that domain to track down and to punish perpetrators of criminal activity and atrocities in cyberspace? So let me give you an example. You look at the Internet of Things and the connectivity delivered by that. So 1 trillion connected devices, what could go wrong? Everything. In forensics, what we say is start at the apocalypse and work back, a little like the Overton window. So the point at which a grid goes down and hospitals lose power and people die, that will be an atrocity in cyberspace. And can the ICC then act in that regard? So I'm a cyber psychologist. I specialize in the impact of technology on human behavior. My specialist area is forensic cyber psychology, which is criminal, deviant, and abnormal behavior online. And believe me, I'm kept very busy. So the paradigm shift, as I say, is to conceptualize cyberspace as a place and realize that what happens in cyberspace impacts on the real world, and what happens in the real world impacts on cyberspace. So there's symbiotic relationship between these two places. We also have to factor in that human behavior fundamentally can change online. So there's a powerful matrix of behaviors, for example, online disinhibition, which dictates that people do things in cyberspace that they would not do in the real world. Amplification, escalation, psychological immersion. So this matrix of factors actually impacts on human behavior in cyberspace. We also have to factor in the adverse effects of global connectivity. In my book, The Cyber Effect, I describe online syndication, which is effectively the mathematics of human behavior in an age of technology. So to date, our interactions have been bound or capped by proximity and domain. In other words, I'm a sex offender in the north of the country and you're a sex offender in the south of the country, not you. What were the chances of us coming together to normalize and socialize our behavior? And now what we see is that activists, cyber criminals, and extremists can find each other within a few clicks. My prediction is, and I hope that I'm wrong, but I don't think so, is that this is going to drive the incidence of criminal, deviant, and abnormal behavior in society back here in the real world. Now we have to think about the filter bubbles and echo chambers and feedback loops that distort and shape the information up by search and social technologies, and how they can profoundly impact our perceptions of the world. But when we think of filter bubbles, we usually think of, well, I like to work out and do sports, therefore I get, Nike trainers targeted at me or a gym membership. But what if you get caught in a filter bubble of distorted thinking, where your distorted thinking, whether it's hate speech or racism or some, radicalized belief, becomes normalized and socialized online? And these distorted opinions become reinforced algorithmically. Now let's consider theoretically how human behavior can be gamed and manipulated online. I mean, we read about it in the press where everybody talks about, the American election and human behavior, and they were manipulated. And really, nobody really understands or has actually gone to any lengths to explain, well, what does that mean? What does that mean scientifically? So this is my job. My job as a cyber psychologist is to illuminate that intersection between humans and technology, or as law enforcement say, where humans and technology collide. So let's consider how this behavior can be gamed and how judgment and decision-making can be altered. So let's think about David Kahneman, or Daniel Kahneman's theory, thinking fast and thinking slow. So effectively, that was a dual process theory of human decision-making. And he described two systems that the brain uses to process information, an automatic alongside a slower, more deliberate mode of thinking. The two systems are active when we're awake, and they're constantly interacting. So as Kahneman explains, System 1 is fast, intuitive, and emotional. System 2 is slower, more deliberative, and more logical. Now let's imagine an elaborate cyber behavioral persuasion, or indeed manipulation model, starting from a point whereby sophisticated cyber actors have harvested individual user data and created a comprehensive psychological profile. And this is exactly what happened in Cambridge Analytica. Operatives that could then focus on a particular individual, and they could manifest System 1-like impressions, immediate impressions, metaphorically trapping the target in a series of filter bubbles, echo chambers, and feedback loops, algorithmically enforced and reinforced by search and social technology, social media content, and then normalized by network homophily, on the principle that similarity breeds connection. So that's a sort of fancy way of saying if everybody around you seems to be racist, it seems to be okay to be racist too. So if endorsed over time by System 2, impressions and feelings may gradually turn into beliefs, and in effect, over time, could manifest as voluntary actions such as voting. To paraphrase Kahneman, manipulating fast and slow. Now let's consider such an operation at scale, a cyber Machiavellian campaign aided and abetted by machine intelligence. Now there's a fine line between manipulative and persuasive technologies, and if you said that to Trump supporters, they would be offended to say, I wasn't manipulated, this is what I believe. But it's a moot point, because whatever is happening, beliefs are being influenced and perceptions are being changed. So we shouldn't dwell on the relative merits of arguing, is this persuasion or is this coercion? Instead, we need to focus on transparency. Why? Because we've been here before. So let's take a quick flashback to the infamous subliminal advertising experiment of the 1950s. I'm sure you all remember that, where you had little ads that were 1/3000th of a second placed into films in movie cinemas, flashing up popcorn or Coca-Cola, and then actually at a subliminal or subcognitive, i.e. below thinking level, persuading people to act in a certain way. And Life magazine at the time in 1958 described this form of subliminal persuasion as being very useful, not just for selling products, but for social initiatives like anti-litter campaigns, and notably, in the context of our discussion today, for the promoting of political candidates. So they actually thought that back in the 1950s. And back then, in an era characterized by the Red Scare, the McCarthy hearings, the Cold War between the Soviet Union and the United States, and the pervasive fear was that Madison Avenue admin could use mass propaganda to make people buy things they did not desire or need, or worse still, to elect Soviet sympathizers into office. We've been here before. And so here we are now in 2018, and the US Senate Select Committee on Intelligence recently completed its review on assessing Russian activities and intentions in recent US elections. And they reported that the leaders of the US Senate Select Committee agreed with intelligence agencies, so that would be the NSA and the CIA, that Moscow sought to interfere with the 2016 US election to boost Donald Trump's prospects of becoming president. So earlier this year, I was invited to meet with congressional staff in Washington of that very committee. And I argued that the investigative brief might have been somewhat limited. In other words, that if you set out to look for Russian interference as an investigative construct in an election, then maybe that's what you might find. Whereas you might have had a broader theme, which would be interference in the election, and you might have been open to looking at other things. You know, to actually start the process with your conclusion couldn't be argued as being very scientific. So my concern was that many of these subtle nuances of the contemporary art of cyber war might be lost in that restrictive framing of just looking at Russia. For example, the creation of context in the cyber ecosystem, and what I spoke about earlier, the environmental psychology of human behavior in cyberspace, how that environment affects our behavior. The impact of subliminal, algorithmic, persuasive, and manipulative technologies, the hidden algorithms that are actually manipulating your belief system, as per my example of the Kahneman model. The uncertain and complex role of social technology, social media enterprises. What are they? Are they enablers? Are they facilitators? Or were they just bystanders? The role of ever-evolving, strategic, networked global alliances. Who is connected to who and what is their mutual agenda? The ongoing development of technological capabilities, particularly regarding artificial intelligence. And the increasingly sophisticated technology-mediated interaction between candidates, campaigners, political consultancy services, like Cambridge Analytica, data brokers, threat actors, hacktivists, nation-states, organized cybercriminals. This is my world, this complex matrix of people, of threat actors who may have an interest in being involved in a particular phenomenon. So allegations of election interference are not confined to the US. We've had Brexit, French, German, and then the recent Mexican elections. The problem is now global. It's therefore useful to consider the relationship between online political campaigning and significant national threats. Governments are becoming increasingly aware of the presence of PSYOPs, so that's psychological operations, or online, my area of expertise but not involvement, cyber PSYOPs. In terms of behavioral manipulation online, subversion can be defined as external interference in a nation's affairs, arguably carried out by foreign state actors or threat actors who are gaming the process remotely. Sedition, however, can be conceptualized as internal dissent, and that could be manifested in the form of a coerced and misinformed public that may ultimately be considered as an insider threat on a national scale. It costs a lot of money and resources to become a superpower in a real-world context, Navy and Air Force and Army. In cyberspace, all it takes is a dozen brilliant scientists and a lot of computing power. So it's open season, effectively, in cyberspace. But it's complicated on the cyber frontier. And the point that I make is that China and Russia are always rounded up and named and shamed in an exercise that resonates with round up the usual suspects, while weaker state actors jockey for power, trying to become stronger and seeking power status. Non-state actors pursue their idealistic goals, whatever that might be. And technology enterprises operate under the radar with little thought given to their potential aspirations of statehood. So basically, some of this I'll use in my discussion here, if I can have 1 minute to wrap up. So the internet has been conceptualized as an infrastructure, similar to a motorway or a railroad. The net may be many things, but it is not simply an infrastructure. It is an entity that has the ability to have a profound and pervasive impact on us all. And focusing just on Russian interference is sort of missing the point. So when we come to the discussion, I'll discuss, well, what can we do about this? But finally, I'll just wrap up by saying, to sustain free and fair elections, we must demand transparency in this new environment of cyberspace. Ultimately, interference in elections, whether in Europe, North or South America, cannot merely focus on reds under the algorithm. In an increasing mountain of big data, it would appear that we cannot see the forest for the trees. And finally, closer to home, we need to think about the impact of cyber manipulation on Irish political process. We must demand complete transparency regarding the relationship between government and social technology companies. We need to understand whether our politicians are acting in the interests of the people or in self-interest. And we need to be aware of the potential for collusion in cyberspace. Political campaigns no longer center on who has the biggest war chest, but arguably who might have the implicit backing of the most effective online platform. In terms of the dark forces undermining democracy, the real question is, are our Irish lawmakers of today deliberately going soft on social technologies, going soft on the electoral kingmakers of tomorrow? Thank you.